Welcome to Fit to Live In, from Ordinances to Outcomes and Habitability. Um, Again, feel free to introduce yourself, your company, where you're from in the chat as you come in. Love to hear from you. And Shelterforce, for a little intro for those who aren't familiar with us, I think a lot of you are readers, but for those who are not, we are a national publication and we cover affordable housing and also community development. We do a lot of reported journalism, but we kind of do a mix of that and explainers about housing. We do opinion pieces, and then we do pieces by people in the field as well, in the housing field. So, also, obligatory ask. We do wish our work was free, but unfortunately it is not. So, we will be dropping now a donation link in the chat to help fund our upcoming Under the Lens series, like this one, which the webinar is based on, and for webinars like this one. So feel free to donate. Oh, don't let me stop you. Um, and feel free to drop your questions in the chat also along the way. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So don't worry, we will get to the questions. I'm going to be receiving them in like a separate DM that my coworker is going to send to me. So don't worry, they're not being like buried throughout the call. Unfortunately, we could not have Ben on from the Nevada Housing Justice Alliance, who was listed in the original send out, but I do recommend that you check out the Alliance's work on tenants' rights legislation because we didn't get a chance to chat about it today. We did have a great article in our series by Franklin Schneider, which was called Why Habitability is a Growing Rallying Cry. And it talked about how habitability is becoming a bigger issue, but also about one particular law that they were pushing in Nevada that was unfortunately vetoed, which was AB 223. I think Steve just dropped it in the chat, that link. I'll start before I get to having the panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to give a little bit of a spiel about Under the Lens and why we took on habitability this time around. So, what is Under the Lens? If you're not familiar, it's basically Shelterforce's opportunity to deep dive about 3 times a year into a different topic that intersects with housing. So our most recent series that I was overseeing was our habitability series, which was called Fit to Live In, Fixing Our Housing Stock. And that one took on a bunch of
Oh,
regional
sorry.
problems and solutions. You're good. And one of them was Cambridge's rehaul of its public housing stock through RAD, for example. Matt, who's one of our panelists, actually wrote an op-ed for the series that was about code enforcement, where it goes wrong, where it goes right, and he'll talk about that more himself later. And Frank was featured in Shelby's article. Shelby R. King, she's in the chat. She's our investigative reporter, and it was about the Healthy Homes program in New Orleans, so he'll also be getting into that. So, why we chose to cover habitability was we were seeing it come up over and over again in tenant organizing campaigns. So, it was an issue that also intersects with other problems that we had been covering that are also getting worse. So, for example, there's deteriorating public housing stock. That's an ongoing issue, but one that only gets worse with time. Obviously, climate change makes everything worse. And we had a climate change series in the fall of 2023. We also had like a housing and disability series before that. So both of those just made us think, okay, we should give its own spotlight to habitability as an issue. And I am also gonna, one last thing before I have the panelists start talking, is I'm gonna talk about what I think habitability means and what it constitutes. So for me, it's kind of in the name, you think of a habitat. And for us, what makes our home a healthy, livable habitat? And that is a really subjective question, which we'll get into a little bit later. But a lot of the common issues that came up in articles we wrote were also the ones that there tend to be laws around. So things like having heating, damage from floods, damage from humidity, like mold, having pests in your home, having adequate cooling or not having adequate cooling, which is becoming more and more of a problem, and more. So not everyone has the same definition. If you'd like to talk about it in the chat, that's also something I'd love to see. And now I'm going to get on to the panelists, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and where you work. Frank, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Yasin Frank Southall. Most folks call me by my middle name, Frank. I'm the organizing communication manager at Jean Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative. We're a community land trust and housing rights organization here in New Orleans. And yeah, I've worked in many cities across the country. So I've seen different habitability standards from California to DC to Ohio. So yeah, I'll pass to Matt.
Well, thank you, Frank. My name is Matt Kreis. I am the general counsel at the Center for Community Progress. My organization works with communities all over the country who are impacted primarily by vacancy and abandonment. And we'll get to a little bit about how we talk about habitability within that context in a little bit. I've been with the organization for about 10 and a half years. And before that, I spent a decade also at the city of Chicago Department of Law, working with a lot of various departments, touching a whole host of these types of issues. A lot focused on vacancy and abandonment, but other community development issues as well. So I look forward to sharing a little bit more with everybody and to learning from everybody else on the call.
Thank you so much. So the obvious question that we've led up to is, what does habitability mean to you? So the reason we're asking this is, as I said, the term can kind of be almost jargony. That's why we renamed our series. It was supposed to have habitability in the title, and I think it was Shelby who was like, we should make it something that means something more to more people, and we changed it to like fixing our housing stock. So let's make sure the guests are on the same page. What does habitability mean to you?
I can go first. So habitability to me is the ability for an individual or family to not only just survive, but be able to like live in advance. It's basically ideal that like one should be able to have a safe temperature standard. Someone should be able to prepare food in the way that people in our country and culture prepare food without any hindrances. They should be able to bathe without many hindrances. That they should be able to be protected from the elements and from pests of any sort. Um, you know, and not only be protected, right? But also ensure that they won't get sick. So in terms of mold, mildew, those type of things. So that's basically it for me. I know that's a very long answer, but the sum total is it the ability for people not just survive, but to thrive.
Well, I have no disagreements with that at all. I think that makes an incredible amount of sense, Frank, and I agree. I think my brain also kind of chunks these things up a little bit, right? Into how does habitability, or how does that word habitability apply in different sort of contexts, right? I think the most common one that pops in my head first is usually the rental properties, right? And the implied warranty of habitability that requires a landlord to provide renters a living space that is fit for someone to live in the way that I think Frank so eloquently just put, right? But it's also, habitability applies in the context of somebody who owns their home, maybe an elderly person or somebody who's aging or fell on hard times, or is struggling to be able to maintain in a way that keeps it free of those conditions and mold, and maybe needs a little bit of help. And then to add sort of a third wrinkle to that, I mentioned earlier that my organization works a lot in those communities that are really impacted by vacancy and abandonment, right? And so what does it mean in terms of habitability, in terms of, how or whether the block or the neighborhood or the community around you is able to allow you to sustain a habitable and successful home on property, right? Are you living in a property that you're struggling to meet those basic habitability, and you got vacant properties on either side of you, impacting the market, resources, all kinds of things that might be able to help you be successful and be more habitable. So I think all of those things make a lot of sense, but I think those kinds of conditions impact how I think about that word too.
Can I encourage folks, if they have any of their own definitions or just any different takes, to share them in the chat? I'd love to see. But I also wanted to follow up with Frank, where you mentioned not just survive, but thrive. Can you go a little bit more into that? I liked what you said about being able to cook your own food.
Sorry. Yeah, so it's just about the ability for anyone to enjoy their home that they're living in and the structure and be able to like advance socially, be able to progress in terms of physical, mental, emotional health. Our dwelling shouldn't leave us worse off than before we came into them. It's essentially that's what I mean by thriving, the ability for people to grow, right? If you're dealing with a stove that doesn't work, right? You can't prepare yourself nutritious meals, right? If you can't take a shower without worrying about the shower leaking into your children's bedroom, right? That's the issue, right? That's going to have outstanding impacts on your mental emotional well-being. And so that's really what we mean by thriving in that regard.
Definitely. All right, I'm going to move on to our next question, which is, um, so what are some of the habitability challenges that you've seen in the communities you've worked in? So I don't know, Frank, you wanted to start? I don't mind mixing it up either way, but Frank, did you want to talk about New Orleans specifically?
Yeah, I can talk about New Orleans. I looked at the entries in here, and a lot of people are coming from the West Coast and North, so some of this may be very foreign for folks, but we don't have any statewide habitability standards beyond standard code enforcement standards for rental properties in our state. So there's no cooling standards, which if you've ever been to Louisiana, you'll know that that's a little bit crazy. It's February right now. I'm grateful for this weather, but it's about 80 degrees, and I refuse to turn on my air conditioner. So this is what we're living with, right? And that's like normal range for February. It's not something dealing with climate change. But with that being said, because of the very conservative right wing nature of our legislature, objectively, it means that there's less incentive to create standards for renters. There's a lot of issues around certain intersection between class and race, obviously. And so we find that in the major cities in the south of the state, which is where a bulk of population lives at, the bulk of renters are black. Whereas when you go further north into Shreveport, Monroe, which culturally tends to resemble more of Arkansas or Tennessee, you see a lot more white renters in the form of mobile home parks, right? And so there's not really a desire to really improve the lot and life of state of renters in these areas. And then, of course, we have climate change, right? Like, it's increasingly getting hotter. There's some more storms. And because even with properties that were subsidized with HUD funds, because of the lack of strong statewide standards, even those properties in like good administrations, like under the Obama administration, it meant that like the type of oversight that people may get in New Jersey or New York where we're only getting a fourth of that. So when these storms come in and there's been delayed maintenance, it means the problems just grow, right? We are kind of working on the formula that we've been trying to figure out for a while, where we can input the number of calls we get around habitability standards, look at certain category hurricanes, and be able to predict whether or not a roof is going to collapse in an apartment building because it's a very basic math, right? If you put 1 plus 1 and these conditions are happening, you can almost predict that there's going to be major issues under certain storms. And we saw that during Hurricane Ida. So these are the major challenges we deal with. And then on top of that, of course, we had Katrina, which due to the federal government's neglect around managing water issues in southeast Louisiana, of course, led to levees collapsing. And so there's all these multiple layers of issues. But we've been able to get some laws passed, which I guess we'll talk about later.
Also, I think something that you mentioned to me earlier, and I saw in Shelby's article that I thought was interesting, was about the kind of unique architecture
Hmm.
of New Orleans. Do you mind chatting a little bit about that and how that works with the climate?
Yeah, so all those issues I mentioned, and then of course, because our architecture in many of our older neighborhoods are designed for cooling, right? And so this intersection of climate change, habitability standards, surrenders rights means that when we have really hot um or days, they're terrible, but they're able to filter out the heat a lot more. When we have incredibly cold days, um, it becomes almost a matter of life or death, because Louisianans aren't accustomed, southern Louisianans aren't accustomed, nor is their architecture designed historically to meet the demands of freezing temperatures. So last year, for example, we had like a foot of snow. It was like the first time ever that ever happened in our region. Um, so it wasn't as bad as Texas, but it was definitely really bad for some people. And because our houses are so drafty and bring in the cool air and keep in the cool air, it really became a life and death situation for some elders. So that's like the other issue we're dealing with, right? It's all intersectional, right? The architecture, climate change, horrible laws that don't protect people, and then also the other thing we are getting right now is just like a massive wave of developers wanting to come to city and profit off the explosion of transient lodging and short-term rentals. And so we have historic neighborhoods being gobbled alive by Airbnb.
Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'm going to remind it's
Sure.
the, oh, I think you know the question. I was going to reiterate it, but go for it.
No, I've got it. I got it.
Okay.
Whether or not I answer it well remains to be seen. I mean, first of all, I think that the question is it's really a broad question, right? And I think that I'm looking at a lot of the names out here on the call right now, many of whom are experts in this area and do incredible work. And I think we could talk about a lot of particular conditions and things like that, or challenges that really impact habitability. I'll talk about two, and I'll talk about it certainly in the context of vacancy and abandonment, and I'll talk about it in the context of rental properties, I think, for just a minute. And starting with rental properties, I think, and this is true for everything, but I think one of the biggest challenges, right, is always those market conditions, right, that really do dictate, the conditions that people are willing to accept, and landlord activity, or I should say investor or slumlord activity, right? I mean, a lot of the communities we work in, especially communities that have a lot of vacancy or abandonment, you often find a lot of neighborhood markets with relatively low real estate values and a clientele desperately in need of housing or shelter, but they don't make a lot of money to pay for it, right? We did a lot of work in Detroit, for example, around some of their rental ordinances, and nearly half of the families that are renters make, I want to say the number, a couple of years ago was it like 30,000 or less, right? And so families that are making that much can only afford a certain amount of money. And so, the property values in Detroit, kind of fluctuates from neighborhood to neighborhood, but you often see the right kind of conditions for investors to acquire properties relatively cheap, maybe from like property tax sale or some other kind of a thing. Slap on a coat of paint and charge one of these families that can barely afford, $600, $700, $800 in a month, that much for property that's substandard, right? A real challenge. And so I think the market on a lot of places, we need to understand what that means, like what it costs to buy a property, what it costs to invest and fix that property to make sure it's completely and totally habitable, but also who are we trying to serve, right? What do they need? And I think that needs to be top of mind. So I think the market is really an interesting thing to think about. Again, we've got to talk about habitability first, right? We've got to figure out a place to live. But The other thing I think that when in the rental context, anytime you talk about enforcement, like who's going to look at these laws and do so? And I think Frank mentioned some really great things and tools that tenants should have access to, right to counsel, all kinds of things to be able to try to protect themselves in the courts and do all those things. Those things are absolutely essential and the number one thing I think you need. But otherwise, you're looking at local governments as well as the ones who are there to sort of enforce these habitability laws. And there's just a lot of challenges with that. It takes a lot of resources to run that program and to do it right. And I think I'll talk in the next, as coming up here a little bit more about some of those things that we've seen and the challenges with doing some of those. But, you also see a whole lot of landlords challenging a lot of these laws around regulating the rental property, right? A lot of Fourth Amendment challenges to inspection programs. They just don't want the government in their property. Tenants are often afraid to call the local government because they're afraid of the retaliatory impact of doing so. I think that whole system presents a whole lot of challenges. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things, coming up next. But, in terms of just identifying those challenges. And then the other one is just what I mentioned earlier, those habitability challenges in communities that have vacant and abandoned properties, right? It's really hard, I think, to, really, I remember working in a city in Kentucky, a smaller city in Kentucky, that we were there to look at like land banking and how they could utilize some of these vacant lots and try to develop some homes because they really had a desperate need for, affordable single family homes in other parts of the community. And we talked with a number of folks and they're like, what's stopping you from developing some of these single family homes or doing things? And they're like, well, honestly, it's, we talked with a lot of developers are trying to develop rental properties and to do those kinds of things where, people that were seen as responsible as you can be in the landlord context, right? And we're like, well, what's preventing you from investing more money into your property? And they're like, it's all the vacancy, right? We don't have a lot of faith, that there's going to be, good investments, that people are going to do good things. It's, this property is sitting there, should have been torn down years ago. And that's impacting our willingness to invest in the property. Now, if they're renting it out, we can have a whole conversation about whether they should be making it habitable anyway. They should. But I think that those kinds of conditions, both market and then the presence of other deteriorating factors and vacancy and abandonment, other, signs of disinvestment, particular in communities that have been experiencing that for decades. I think those are major challenges to this issue that need to be at least part of the conversation.
And when you mentioned the Fourth Amendment challenges and the landlord legal challenges, are you talking about something that's ramping up in recent years?
I mean, I have seen more cases about that a little bit lately. I think there are probably others who would have a better system of whether or not my perception is true. But I think when we're seeing a lot of challenges to systems where the government is kind of going into your property and taking it. I know that's been coming up in Ohio lately and in other places around the country. So again, I think landlords are just trying to, get around some of those habitability programs, particularly where there's maybe some more proactive rental inspection programs that are happening programs that I think can be structured in a way that can really help to elevate the quality of the housing stock that's available. But I think some of those are we're seeing more challenges in that way.
I'm seeing a lot of interesting stuff in the chat, so I'm just gonna point out that folks were dropping some other like definitions and problems they see with habitability. One I really liked was seeing privacy. We did have an article, I'm going to drop it in the chat when I have a chance to find it. It was by Ross Chapin, and he talked about kind of going beyond basic living standards. And he gets into things like designing for privacy, for happiness, for having like a walkable neighborhood. And that's definitely something to keep in mind, is that it's not just like not freezing. But of course, sometimes those issues come first, but I liked that. And then also things like lack of insulation, retaliation for reporting.
Hello, this is Harold.
Someone talked about no enforcement, which we're going to get into, and then also being
Yes.
elderly and having disabilities and having an apartment without accessibility features. That's a little bit more intersection. So thank you guys for sharing in the chat. Um, Going on to our next question. Our next question is about legislation. So the question is, what kinds of legislation have been either recently introduced or passed in the areas you guys have worked in relating to habitability? And what makes those laws pass or fail, which could be specific to that specific law, it could be just general.
Yeah. So in New Orleans, we passed a law called Healthy Homes Ordinance. And so our habitability standards law is literally referred to as healthy homes, which I think as everyone would understand, we did for explicit social and political reasons to create that framework. And basically it was a set of standards that we basically just stole from like somewhere in the north. Like I think it was like someplace in Illinois where we're like, let's do this. Let's just copy this. It's sensible. Um, One of my former board members, Maxwell, may disagree, but basically that's just of it. We're like, what do other cities have that are just things that people need? And then we fine tune it to our lived reality, right? And that's how we really created, and we did it with coalition. One of the biggest coalitions I've ever seen in this city. We had over 40 organizations. I would say about 50% of them were very actively engaged. 25% of the organizations were groups that had deep memberships, so that like when we need to get people to go city hall, we were able to amass those numbers. But the most important thing we did is we used tend to organize and struggle at a complex with a notorious landlord that even like our Republicans will use as an example of a bad landlord, right? Joshua Bruno. Um, there's a couple of different issues that are really big there. And we're organized tenants, and we're able to explain tenants that one of the solutions that could have counteract what they were going through was healthy homes. And yeah, that's basically what we did in that regard. One of the things that was very critical to our success is the fact that we had an army of pro bono attorneys, literally attorneys who were off the clock, who worked at various nonprofit organizations. Um, my friends, literally anyone we could get to do legal research about how to do this um, uh, ordinance. And the rationale is the reason why we had to do that is because in Louisiana, we are preempted by several laws that restrict municipalities or parishes, which is a term we call counties here, from enacting laws that interfere in between the relationship between the tenant and the landlord when it comes to money being exchanged. And so what we did is we just did a lot of research and realized that we created a permit process that ultimately municipalities and parishes in Louisiana are allowed to issue permits for everything, right? The city of New Orleans is the sole issuer of hotel licenses, for example, right? The state doesn't do that. So we basically figure out a legal strategy that if some asshole in Baton Rouge and their state legislature tried to pass a law restricting our habitability standards ordinance, it would test a live day. And so that's what we did. And so far, knock on wood, we haven't seen any legal challenges to it because it's so, if they sued the city over it, it would undo loss of permitting and license. And I think the corporations in our state would not like that. So yeah, we had to do a lot of work in order to get it passed. Um, and I think really that's it. But one of the other things, I mean, I think as I mentioned, we literally looked at other city standards in Illinois and Ohio. But really it was building connections with other states in deep South about what they were experiencing, that also led some of our attorneys to looking at certain um, uh, uh, legal routes, because basically all of our preemption laws in Deep South are similar to each other, right? And so that was really something that helped us out, like, just this regional alliance and regional solidarity and mutual aid.
Definitely. Matt, I think it's your turn.
Boy, where do I start? I think in the article we put out there, right? I think one of the things that I put out there is that, especially when it comes at least to the community, it's to also recognize, right? Like, everybody is in a bit of a different place, right? And I'm not just talking about rental properties. I'm talking about the broader context of a neighborhood and things first. Like, everybody comes from a different place. Everybody is in a different situation, right? And, as far as what pieces of legislation have really been introduced, passed, or really worked recently, sometimes it's just recognizing that more than the legislation, what we need is to better understand the needs of the people that live there. And, is this an issue in a particular neighborhood of resources, right? Is it, are there more aging homeowners who need more support, right? Are there issues of, other economic issues? Can we do things like just put together a community toolbox, monthly cleanups that offer support and things like that? I think, we can pass a lot of laws to figure out how to address things that are out there, but I think we need to do more as a community. And I'm also talking from the local government perspective of understanding the needs of the community that live there and how we can better address them. So I think we can also then use that information to help craft better standards that we can realistically enforce, that are actually going to keep people safe and habitable. And so I think as far as legislation that's been introduced, I can tell the story. I mentioned this earlier with my colleagues, Alan Malik and Dan Lewinsky and others, and a whole host of people in the city of Detroit. We took a look at Detroit. One of the things that we've often talked about that can be effective in helping to address rental properties is a proactive rental registration and inspection type of program. Where landlords are required to register their properties with the community, and then are subject to regular inspections every 3 years or so, where local government comes in and makes sure that is there lead present in some cases? And we talked about that in the context of Rochester in the piece. Is there mold? Is there running water? Is there heat? Is there again, the heating and cooling systems that need to be there, right? Are these people living in basically safe conditions? And theoretically, those things can work really well. But the problem was Detroit had something on those books for a long time, and they added in a bunch more conditions around habitability, especially around lead paint in 2017. And they asked us to come in and take a look and say, we don't think we're complying. We don't think people are complying. We have a pretty low compliance rate. What's going on here? And so, it was the new changes to their laws were in 2017. And then in 2023, 2024, at that point in time, they had about a 10% compliance rate. About 10% of landlords had gotten a certificate of occupancy that would allow them to sort of legally rent those properties out. And so we did a whole lot of work to try to figure out sort of what was the problem. Like, why weren't landlords registering? What about the tools to hold them accountable? What weren't working, right? The whole thing. And you can read the report and you can agree with some of the findings or not. But I think, some of the things that I think were really important that, were things to keep in mind. I talked about the market, understanding that market a little bit, make sure that they understood like what people could afford to pay, what landlords could be charging, other things like that. So I think that some of the changes that they ended up making were around also protecting tenants, right? Improving that tenant escrow program, things like that. that were available. I think a lot of what we found in that case is that every time you build this type of program and you require landlords to submit to some kind of registration component and you're looking to protect tenants, you need to understand a lot of the conditions that lead to non-compliance in the beginning, and a lot of the vulnerabilities that exist for that particular set of folks too. So I think that, for example, one issue in Detroit that we found is, there's a rent escrow program which allows tenants to pay directly into the city their rent if a landlord is not complying or has not gotten a certificate of occupancy for that building. And almost nobody had taken up on it. Well, one of the main reasons we found was that most renters in Detroit don't actually have a written lease. And that was a requirement to participate in the rent escrow program, right? Again, you can see why maybe somebody, behind a desk thought that made some sense for a condition, but at the end of the day, that requirement made it so that program was wholly inaccessible, right? And so I think that there's just a number of things that we've then recommended, and Detroit ended up identifying themselves to sort of pass and sort of make some of those parts of their program a little bit more functional. Hopefully some of the changes that they're making to help landlords comply, particularly landlords that are serving more vulnerable communities, and to help make sure tenants have access to the type of protections they were intended to have happen, will result in greater compliance over time.
I have some really small follow-up questions for each of you. So,
Sure.
Matt, I was curious, you mentioned building a community toolbox. Can you kind of describe what you mean by that?
I'm sorry, I just glossed over that. I think that, some of the communities that we work in, Gary, Indiana has created them. A lot of other communities have. We're talking mostly about habitability and living standards inside the house, but a lot of folks, you can start to see evidence of the decline in their ability to maintain their properties on the outside, right? They have trouble mowing their grass, taking their garbage out, or you see a larger accumulation of stuff just kind of happening. And so communities have created these community tool sheds or toolboxes. Sometimes the local government helps to stock those with certain tools, with rakes and other machinery that might be helpful at cleaning up mowers, things like that, where community members can go out and borrow from that tool shed to go out and help do some things in the community. Volunteers can help do some of the work there. So there's been some really good programs out there around the community tool sheds, things like that.
Gotcha. I was taking it much more metaphorically, so I appreciate that.
Yes.
You explained that.
I was thinking more concretely there. Yeah.
Frank, I had a question about building a coalition. What did it take to build that coalition? Was there anything that did it naturally come together? Did it require a lot of work?
There was natural elements of it. I mean, for some people, even if they're not working in housing, like one of our unions, Unite Here, they organized two big, large hotels. And so they were hearing from some of their, some of the workers that they were living in absolute horror. And so Unite Here was sort of like down to like fight and figure out ways to get tougher standards in place. Some other orgs were a little bit more reluctant, in part because of the way that wealth generation works in our city is property is a major driver of wealth and economic stability for some of our upper middle class folks. And so there's a lot of different issues impacting that. But at the end of the day, most people said, like, hey, we see what you guys are doing. You guys aren't trying to take away homes from working class Black communities or working class Black landlords. And we were able to articulate, despite what the landlord lobby was trying to state incorrectly, that basically we were aiming most of this legislation at big corporate landlords, those private equity firms that are gobbling up property. And once people understood that, it became easier to build coalition. And part of that has to do, again, due to unique architectural designs of many of our houses, and that, there's this thing called shotgun double that's pretty common in New Orleans, where you'll have the owner of the house live on one side, and then you'll have a rental unit living on the other side. And so that's a big number of rental units in many of our core neighborhoods. So once we got around sort of like the fear mongering of the landlord lobby, we're able to build pretty easily across different sectors: healthcare, education, youth development. Yeah, we were able to bring a very diverse coalition together.
I think that's a good reminder that this issue, more than many that Shelterforce talks about, is so regional and even city to
Mhm.
city because we all have different types of housing, we have different climates, we have different demographics, different like age groups that are living in that housing. So it's just good to keep in mind. It's nice to get, that's why I liked the series to get a big regional perspective because things in New Mexico are different from things in New Orleans, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But yeah, so moving on to our next question is there's a bit of overlap here, but it's about what makes for effective and ineffective enforcement of habitability laws. I don't know who wants to go first.
Matt, do you want to go first this time?
Sure, I can. Sure. So actually, I think this dovetails nicely with one of the questions that was in the chat around what are some of the best examples of well-designed rental registries. So we've been talking about that a lot, so I'll just kind of continue along that a little bit. And again, I'll give my perspective. There are others who do great work in this area out there too. If anybody's curious to, I mean, I think we've written some good stuff, but also Change Lab Solutions is a West Coast organization too. They've put out a proactive rental inspection ordinance, like a template ordinance that's really interesting to take a look at. For folks, obviously it needs to be tailored everywhere you go. But I think for me, when you talk about habitability laws, I mean, I think there's the standards of what habitability should mean, right? That's one thing. And I think we need to be clear on what those are. And I do think that, at a very basic, especially when we're talking about rental properties, we just need to define first, like, what are those very basic standards that absolutely need to be met to ensure that that person is living in a safe, healthy place, right? Like Frank said earlier, these people should be living in a space where they can cook their food the way they want, right? Where they don't have to have fear of mold or other things like that. I think we need to decide what those are and make sure they're super clear, right? Like, and not overly complex and overly things. We have very complex building codes, property maintenance codes all over the country. And again, I'm not saying that a lot of those things aren't important. We have, different lead inspection standards and different things in different places. We need to just understand what those are, what the housing stock is in our community, right? Do we have an older housing stock, right? Like the city of Detroit or a lot of northeast cities, right? That, houses were built pre-1980, pre-1970, pre-1960, right? We have to understand what the type of housing stock it is, and then build those standards to ensure that we can realistically comply with them and keep people safe at the same time. So I think that's the first part of understanding what that means. The second part to me is some of the things that I've heard Frank at least talk about, and maybe Frank will get into this a little bit more, but really making sure that, who are the people that are impacted here and how are they protected? I've seen a lot in the comments and other places talking about, every time a tenant raises an issue of whether or not those standards are being met, they put themselves at risk, right? Can the landlord be retaliating for that? Retaliatory evictions are something we know a lot can happen, right? Is a tenant really stuck, right? Are they not on a written lease? And it's the only place they could afford, and this was the only landlord that was willing to rent to them, and they're charging them an exorbitant amount, but they can't find any place else to go. Maybe they have a record or something along those lines, right? So we have to understand and build an ecosystem where we can allow those tenants to communicate when there are problems and not risk displacement, right? So are we going to get that right perfectly? No, but I think things like right to counsel, rent escrow programs, we got to have a network of folks that are there to help educate and support those folks too. There are a lot of communities that might have some of these things in place, but who are the lawyers or advocates that are there to support those folks, right? So as we start thinking about, okay, maybe we want to enforce these standards a little bit more and build out maybe a proactive rental inspection program, is aggressive enforcement on the side of the local government going to actually result in displacement as opposed to helping to elevate the quality of the thing? So I think those are the two questions that you should start those out. And the third element I would say that may not be as popular is to really find your good landlords, right? Because they're there. And I know that there are communities where there aren't a lot of them. And there is a huge subset who have capitalized on the vulnerabilities of people that live there. But in my experience, in a lot of communities, there are a subset of very good landlords who do want to do well. Yes, they want to make money, but they also they don't want to hurt anybody. And I think as you're designing a system, you've got to find who those folks are, and work closely with them to try to design a type of system that at the very least they're going to be okay with, right? And so one of the things that we talk about, the basic program, gist of a rental program is you register your property, you subject yourself to regular inspections, and you meet those standards in the regular inspections, and you get a certificate that's valid for a certain period of time. And then at the end of that period of time, you get that redone. I think as we learn more about these communities that are trying to do it, I think what we also want to do is focus enforcement on really trying to identify, make sure that we know what the good landlords are doing, make it easy for them to comply with these habitability standards. They still have to be met, but make it easier for them to sort of get through this inspection process, get their license, and try to focus as much as we can on identifying who are the bad landlords, right? Who are the landlords that are failing to offer or meet those basic habitability standards? And how can we leverage some of the data that we have at the local government level on compliance rates, conditions, reports from other folks to try to identify who those landlords are and try to focus most of those limited local government resources on identifying those bad landlords and really helping to take them account. Easier said than done. Minneapolis, Minnesota has actually done some really good things over the years to try to use data to really focus their efforts on prosecuting and really regulating bad landlords. And they do so by sort of segmenting landlords into different tiers based on, historical compliance rates, whether or not they're passing, whether or not people are reporting them for other things like that. So that was a lot about rental properties. I have a lot more about other legislation makes effective enforcement on other things with vacant and abandoned property. But I think I'll stop there and see what Frank has to say.
Thank you, Matt. So I would say that my perspective is a little bit more, it's nuanced given the conditions we live in Louisiana. So getting Healthy Homes passed was a major win and victory for not just renters in New Orleans, but really the housing rights and housing justice movement in the South, if not in the country, that one of the most conservative states. Without New Orleans, Louisiana would be more conservative than any state you could think of. But our metro area is significantly more progressive than many other areas of the country. And so getting it passed was like a major victory. However, due to all of these compounding impacts of the pandemic and not affecting our city's budget and now Trump, and just what Trump's done to cut funding for municipalities. And then of course this, economic downturn we're in, and the fact that tourists aren't coming here, it means that like our city is in an economic crisis. Whereas, coming out of the pandemic, there was economic issues, but we weren't in a crisis. And so what that means is there's been sort of like a freeze on hiring inspectors. There's also the fact that our inspectors are house and code enforcement, which is something we're working on trying to get them moved out. So rather than hiring inspectors just for healthy homes, for rental units, they decide to keep them just in the code enforcement. So they did hire 10 new code enforcement inspectors, and there were other staff to support that work. But the problem being is that uh, someone can always be pulled away. The one thing I will say about our system is that if you are vigilant, if you do call like two, three times, if they haven't processed your case, and they will send someone out. Now that could be because not the full range of people who should be using healthy homes are using it. That could be it. But either way, I will say that when I tell tenants, hey, just call again. If you called once, and usually they'll get someone. And usually when tenants come to our local tenant union, the New Orleans Renters Rights Assembly, and those group of folks escalate things, then tenants they get results really quickly. We had one tenant who was on a permanent supportive housing voucher, who's a Renters Rights Assembly member, and he was able to use healthy homes to prevent a retaliatory eviction. Because I think I forgot admissions, but that's one of the key things about our law. Then we were able to research and realize going like a license permit way was the key route. We're able to put a stipulation in saying that, hey, if you want to rent your properties in the city of New Orleans, you cannot retaliate against the tenants if they are making complaints. And it's perfectly legal. It doesn't run afoul of any of our state laws. And so that's to protect thousands and thousands of tenants when they've made complaints. Now, unlike some other municipalities, you still have to be in compliance with the rest of your lease, paying your rent. There's no, I literally forgot the term, even though I grew up in Ohio and lived in California, but there's no escrow withholding, right? That exists. That's illegal, explicitly in our state law. But what that does allow is for other routes to ensure that landlords are financially penalized. So doing like abatement cases, for example, you combine that with the retaliation piece. A judge goes like, hey, landlord, you can't evict this person, you're retaliating against them. Then it's flagged to the judge that, hey, maybe this tenant should have some type of abatement consideration. And so we've seen judges do abatement without even being prompted by the lawyer. And so that's like a sort of like 180 compared to how things were done 8 years ago. And so in that way, things are better. But we find that unless we're organizing an apartment complex, tenants aren't getting macro relief. There's not widespread relief. For tenants in smaller structures, the city is much more quicker to repair things. But it's in those apartment complexes that have 200 or more units where we see things not working in mass for tenants. Um, so it's kind of like a glass half full situation, where yes, it works, doesn't work in mass for everyone. In my opinion, as I think I mentioned Shelby in the article, no, I don't think it works in mass for everyone. But I do think it can work, but it takes a lot of self advocacy and connecting with orgs. And even though I'm a tenant organizer at heart, I don't want people to have to connect to me in order to get justice. I think people should be able to get justice just by calling the city that they're paying taxes to. So yeah, that would be sort of my answer in that regard. I know it was not a very clear answer, but it's incredibly nuanced.
No, I appreciated it. I wanted to know, is there anything else you guys wanted to say on this? Because it's a bit more of a complex topic, or do you want me to move on to the next question?
I do want to add
Yeah.
something, because I've been fortunate to be able to travel to over 10 countries on 4 continents to look at how they do habitability standards, um, habitability standard laws. And the thing I would say is that the money pieces that grew of it, more inspectors and penalizing landlords harder get better results. As well as tier system. Matt mentioned the whole piece around, we don't want to force a small working class black and brown landlord out of business who is just barely holding on their home. I mean, I've talked with landlords who I've gone into their houses and I'm helping figure out how to get resources for them. And so these things again have to be very nuanced. And I think for me, we are more focused on targeting corporate landlords, not just because private equity is a new boogeyman that we shall hate, which we should hate private equity, obviously, but more importantly, because these people have political and economic and social influence. And while I can't pinpoint anything, I will say that objectively, I can show you landlords who it takes a longer time, like they have the same amount of units, corporate landlords. One landlord, it will like the city will go after very quickly, and then another one, it will take them like a week, 2 weeks to go after. And just saying that like that aspect of money and politics, we can't pinpoint, we can't say anything for sure, but we feel as though there's connection there. So that's why I would say that like if the city did have more inspectors and more oversight, then I think we would see things moving quicker. But that just could be a Louisiana problem.
I think that's an everywhere problem, Frank.
All right, I'll go on to our final question before we get to Q&A, which is about it's kind of a good summary, which is how can we use habitability laws to create better homes? So, what are some best practices from everything you guys have learned?
Am I going then? um, I mean, I think that there's a whole host of things. Like we've talked a lot about rental properties, and again, this is we're kind of widespread here. Again, I think to me when you're designing these habitability, how can we use them? I think Frank hit on a huge one, right? Which is resources. I mean, the fact is in many jurisdictions these laws exist in some way, shape, or form. And I think somebody put in a chat, or they were talking about New Jersey. I think their point was we've got habitability related laws on the books, right? They're there. We just don't have anybody to enforce them, right? And I think that point that you were making a little bit earlier, Frank, is huge, right? The fact is that I think it depends. Some jurisdictions have done well for advocating for more help at the local government level for code enforcement, things like that. I do think it's not as big a priority, right? Code enforcement isn't always the most popular function of local government to support, and certainly not to fund. And I think that, their departments are strapped. And so what do they do in most cases? I think they focus on the calls coming in and they prioritize them in case of like, is this one going to fall down, or did this elected official call me today about that property? Right. And, in a way that allows them to barely kind of keep their head above water. It doesn't allow for more proactive use. I talked a lot about some of the ideal elements of a proactive rental inspection strategy, right? Well, you can't do that unless you have the staff to be able to conduct those inspections and to do a good job when they're conducting the inspections. And by the way, to work with a landlord who is trying to comply or may not understand. Right? Frank, you brought up, sometimes families like accidentally become, they inherited that property from their family, and if their parents passed away and maybe they're heirs and they really want to do this right, but maybe they need some more resources to figure out how to do it. And if all the code enforcement officer has is that hammer, write the citation, fine you the maximum amount, and walk away and leave you, maybe we're missing an opportunity to really build up the capacity of that local landlord who's entrenched in the community, who we want to be a good landlord. So I think resources are key. Somebody else also talked about, still talking about owner-occupied properties as well. And I think, again, resources come into play. Do we have enough inspectors to allow them to sort of work with community members, go out more proactively to community members, maybe where there's more owner occupants, and actually do some education work, right? Or go through and just be like, hey, listen, these are some of the things that, sometimes people get dinged for. Here are some local contractors. Here are some ways you could deal with this. Here's a program that's at Home Depot. Here's a grant program we're aware of, right? Code enforcement officers are often, from a local government standpoint, one of the first folks out in the community in the face of that local government. And there's a real opportunity there for them to be seen as a resource, right? Not necessarily an adversary, and particularly for folks that are out there. And that may be aspirational. We point in the article to the city of Peoria, Illinois, which has done, it sounds cheesy, but I think it's really worked. They've worked really hard to build a new culture of what they call code encouragement. They work really hard to build relationships in the community members. They hire people within the community. They do some really fascinating and interesting programs. They do coffee with inspectors, and they try to really respond and build relationships so that people call them before there's a problem. Is that always going to work? No, right? It's not going to be perfect, but I think that there are ways and opportunities that are out there for folks to kind of do it. So how can we use habitability laws to create better homes for people to live in? I can see that laws can be really helpful, but I think it's more about investing more resources and building out a culture of support that hopefully leads to a greater culture of compliance, almost more than anything. And there are things about our law that we can absolutely change. We absolutely have to have those good laws on the books, but we have to prioritize putting the budget and the resources behind those laws to make them work. Otherwise, they're just not going to. And I don't mean that to be negative. I just think that that's a really, really important point that we often forget about.
I echo a lot of things Matt said. For me, as an organizer and as a coalition builder, I also think about what are we working towards? So we first got right to council pass intentionally because we just wanted to be able to ensure that if we were going out to complexes, organizing tenants, that there would be legal representation, right? And the healthy homes in the anti-retaliation piece, as you can imagine, we think about tenant organizing, makes so much more sense. The third piece that we decided to do was around a housing trust fund. Basically, we want to flood the market with better opportunities, right? And so that's kind of where our thinking is, that it can't just be like, aha, we got this thing passed, it will work, right? If there were, for example, 6,000 more affordable apartment units that were priced at 600, for a one bedroom, 800 two bedroom, our landlords would be out of business, right? Not our landlords, sorry, our slumlords would be out of business, right? Whether they're being subsidized by federal dollars or not, they would just not exist, right? So all these things are intersectional. But as we saw from many natural disasters, and I think it was Dion or someone who mentioned the piece around, or Valerie mentioned the piece around dealing with what was the framework or the phrase used, but like low quality profit maximizing apartment buildings. We're all living through this. It doesn't matter if you're in the Bay Area or like elsewhere. We hear horrible stories about shady housing being built for even upper middle class people. So like it's like if we have better standards, they will uh help to force a culture of care, a culture of accountability. So it just can't be habitability standards law. It has to be all these things working together. And so I think really for us in New Orleans, like, you know, the previous question when I was asked about like, does it work? Um, it works more than 50% time, in my opinion, because we have these other things working for people. The fact that the organization I work at is a community land trust. We moved one of the families in a substandard apartment complex owned by Richard Hamlet's company. The guy based out of Memphis, he owns a couple substandard buildings. Millennia basically brought a huge part of his portfolio a couple years ago. And because we were able literally to offer housing as like a group, we were able to move this family in. And so our vision is that, like, we don't want Jane Place to own 2,000 units. We do want other community orgs to have those 2,000 units so that, like, we can ensure that any slumlord tenants can organize and put them out of business. Um, and tenants aren't afraid to organize because they're not going to be afraid that their unit will be condemned, right? So all these things have to be intersectional, working together. And I would say that New Orleans, due to the will of the people and the will of the tenants, is moving in that direction, though not as fast as I would like it to be.
I guess it's time to move on to our Q&A portion. There's a lot of great
Can I?
questions in the chat. Oh, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, Lara. I just wanted to add one other thing that's out there. Again, I talked about resources a little bit, and everything Frank said was excellent. I just also want to add in the fact that, I talked about market. I talked about a lot of things in terms of, how do people comply with these habitability laws? How do we do that? And I think that there's, the costs of doing so, particularly if we want to make sure that folks are continuing to offer safe and habitable space. In some cases, resources are going to be needed in terms of repair grants, home repair grants, weatherization types of grants, all kinds of things. We do not have enough resources to be able to help folks provide housing that will not, totally negatively impact the affordability of that housing necessarily in a lot of places. And so I do want to say, like, in terms of resources, we also need resources to be able to help folks, particularly low-income homeowners with home repair grants, but also if there are a subset of landlords that are providing good, safe, and healthy housing at an affordable rate, right? Are there resources that might be available to encourage them to continue to maintain and comply in other places? Again, whether or not that's low interest loans or grants or things like that for home repair. So I think that that's a couple of pieces that we didn't really touch on that contribute to success here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm looking at a lot of these questions, and it's going to be possible that you guys have already somewhat answered them when I say them. So if you have, let me know. It's just hard to keep track of which ones have and haven't been answered. One that I was seeing a couple questions about was LLCs, whether folks are seeing LLCs pop up in their communities and if there are any specific ways to hold them accountable. Is that something either of you have any thoughts about?
Our Healthy Homes law demands a manager's contact info. So basically, sort of like, I'm not going to explain this in the most succinct, best legal way, but basically, like, it can't just be a manager going like, sorry, my boss is private or my boss refuses to do this. It's like, no, the legal accountability falls on you, right? And so that's one way that we've been able to escalate things. I know that we're trying to work something into our rental registry where basically LLCs are like unhidden. Basically, where like whoever is the direct owner of the property is known to the city. But I will have to get back to folks about that one. But yeah.
Hesitate to say this, bane of my existence, right? I could not agree with that over. I mean, Frank, I love what they're trying to do in New Orleans, and other communities have tried to address that in a number of ways. A lot of ordinances, both for rental or for vacant properties or other things like that, have tried in previous years to ensure that LLCs that own property, particularly with registration programs, right, also list and register a local property manager, things like that. I think that's an important point to that. But I think the ultimate, whether or not you're able to hold that type of an entity accountable is really hard, right? In a lot of places, all we have is criminal enforcement type of laws, and kind of hard to hold an LLC criminally liable, right, for certain things. It's really hard to track down the owners of an LLC, which is something we've talked about, and they can hide behind, numerous layers of, member managers and whomever. It's really, really tough to find them. And then, by the way, that single asset LLC may have zero other assets within it. So they're sort of judgment proof, right? If you're trying to extract some money to cover the nuisance abatement that you just did. Well, they don't have any money. They just have it against the property. So I think one of the things that my organization encourages the use of, and this is particularly true with vacant properties, right? There are potential harms with using this on occupied properties that you need to be mindful for, but is really focusing on trying to make sure that your state and local laws allow for in rem enforcement. Right. So when you do a nuisance abatement action or you try to hold them accountable, you can lien the property and do so in a way and then enforce that lien in a way that causes that owner to potentially, the consequence is potentially the loss of the property. Now, when you're talking about a rental property, boy, you better have a pretty good system in place to make sure that if you do go down that path, you have some form of responsible management so you're not displacing folks take over, right? Or you have a sufficient place to help folks go to. But I think, especially in the context of vacant property, really focusing less on the punitive aspect of it and more in the, if you don't fix this up and we have to do something about it, then you need to pay the public back their costs for continuing to focus on it. And if you don't do any of that, if you can't fix it up, if you can't pay us back for the taxpayer costs that we've incurred in trying to make this safe, then you better be prepared to give it up through some kind of public lien foreclosure or something else like that to try to, fire the owner, if you will. Again, that might work better in the context of vacant properties, but is something that I think, when you look at LLC ownership, it's going to be awful hard to hold them personally accountable. And so I think it's worth thinking about how our laws are structured to focus on the property itself and what we can do to compel that compliance.
There was another question that, Frank, you said in the chat you were going to answer. Did you already get to this one? Has anyone teamed up with local homeowners about addressing rental properties?
Yeah, I want to answer that really quickly. So we have tried that. I will be very honest that, and this is probably more of a New Orleans situation, where our big apartment complexes are located at. They're in sort of like these post-World War II suburban areas that had a lot of white flight within the city. And so the middle class communities left. Basically, you have these big apartment complexes where there's a lot of social issues surrounded by middle class neighborhoods. And oftentimes we found that many of the neighborhood association residents literally privately will just like find me and they'll go like, hey Frank, I think you understand this. You would never want to live next to a substandard apartment building. And we think that's best for people in our community that the whole apartment building just gets torn down. And so it makes it really hard to build coalition that way. I'm not saying that all the folks are NIMBYs and classes, but we find in mass that strategy doesn't work well. But that could be a more New Orleans issue. But I suspect that in general, the way that people in our country feel about low income um, uh, voucher holders and other people experiencing housing insecurity issues, people don't take kindly to having an apartment building next to their home. So that's one of the reasons why we've never really embarked on that as a coalition um, tool. Now, I will say we will work with individuals within neighborhood associations. So there's a really amazing person in the most powerful neighborhood association in New Orleans East, Miss Aber. And Miss Aber is just like, she's not like, a socialist. She's not like, reading Marx, but she believes that people should have quality housing. And so she's able to like be our barrier towards the NIMBY. So we found champions in neighborhood groups like that, but otherwise, building coalition with neighborhood associations around these issues can be very, very difficult.
Matt, do you have anything you wanted to say for that one, or shall I move on to another question? Oh, I saw a question about how best to combat landlord retaliation. Do either of you have any input on that one?
I mean, we just put that into our law. So that's for us what you generally should do. Depending on what preemption looks like in your state, definitely get again a couple of your friends who are legal nerds to do some research about how to craft ordinance to avoid preemption issues. But that for us really solved, I would say, about 70-80% all the retaliation issues that we see.
That's awesome. I think it's another case too where resources, right? Like who's monitoring it, who's paying attention to this, right? And who's available to be able to hold that landlord who is illegally retaliating or retaliating against a tenant for reporting the problem. Who's holding them accountable? Do we have the resources, the legal staff, whomever it is that we're needed to do accountable? I mean, you can build in things like in the law that are really important, right? Like if you raise these things, you cannot do so. I think there was, I know I keep going back to Detroit. It's just because it was one area where I've spent a lot of time recently, but part of the law was that a landlord can't evict if they don't have a valid certificate of occupancy, right? And I think that part right there, like, so what they were trying to do is make sure that the court itself wouldn't allow a landlord to file an eviction if they hadn't shown that they had complied with the rental standards for that program, right? So I think that's an interesting one. You got to build in partnership with the courts and do education too to make sure that they're on board to avoid that eviction. But again, so many of these retaliatory evictions don't end up going through the courts, right? It's the landlord basically kicking them out and nobody's around to kind of help monitor it, right? It happens sort of off the books. Maybe the tenant just got scared and the landlord told them you're out, right? And they threw their stuff out. Where did they go? I don't know. There's a whole lot of pieces to that. And I think there are ways that you can build things into the law, but I think that we have to be honest too about what the reality is. It's how is that actually happening before we can design the tool to actually address it.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, really quickly, I forgot to mention how our retaliation process works. So you may remember me earlier in the call saying that like actual getting code enforcement inspectors come out can be really slow unless there's like a match lit under their butts to move quicker. Sometimes, The one good thing about our anti-retaliation clause is that the second a tenant reports it to city, it gets flagged in the massive database that like our civil district court has, in which first city and second city court are based in. Those are the two courts that hear evictions for our city. And basically, like, say for example, I report my landlord and say, hey, like my landlord, it has to fix my air conditioning unit, and I report it like 2 months before my landlord takes me to court. It will automatically pull up in the docket for the judge that this situation is occurring. So the judge knows in advance there's a healthy homes complaint, and they're required by law to first address that issue. Now, the landlord can overcome a healthy homes complaint, say if if there's a just cause reason, such as like, or just cause eviction, um, before, sorry, my brain's not working. If the landlord has like issue around payment, rent, around threats of violence, they can use that to overcome that. But we intentionally educate tenants to, hey, like, say if you have a barbecue on your deck, right, and that's not allowed in the lease. Get that barbecue inside the house. And then when the landlord goes to court, the landlord goes like, hey, there's a barbecue pit on the deck. And the tenant goes like, what proof do you have in the last month that I did that? And it works out. So that's like basically how our process works. I don't think it's particularly novel. I think a lot of cities have situations like that where like tenant complains and then gets routed to central system, that when the tenant's legal name gets pulled up in the eviction court docket, it's just there. But yeah, I will say that that piece is like it's uh made my beard and hair less gray. Um, Let me put it that way. So yeah.
Oh, we are coming up on time, so I'm a little worried about addressing any other questions. So instead, I'm going to say, for the two of you, do you have any quick things you want to make sure you share before we go, before I give my very short little closing spiel?
Really just to work with partners around the country. I mean, everything we do in New Orleans is done in collaboration. I think also regional partners, like Jane Place is a member of Homes for All South. So like whatever part of the country you're in, try to work with regional partners across state lines, because you will be more inspired uh, by learning what's happening. And then just build good relationships. If you're not an attorney, just build good relationships with attorneys who are down to nerd out and do legal research for you. Because that has helped us out so much.
I don't have anything else really to add, Lara. This was great. I really appreciate y'all letting me get the chance to share. I think, yeah, Shelterforce, what you're doing to bring light to some of this stuff is fantastic. Ultimately, like the way things get done, the way ordinances change, the way the laws change matters so much. And somebody said this in the chat, like local media, national media, others bringing attention to this issue. Sometimes otherwise the changes won't happen. I think that was certainly the case in a lot of the places I've worked. It was started that way. So I think continuing to urge transparency and build partnerships with national, state, or local media to really help to shed light on it is such an important piece. So thanks for giving me a platform to share a little bit. I appreciate it.
That's us. Thank you very much, guys. This was such a lovely conversation, and I really appreciate you making time. And thank you so much for folks. This was such an active, thoughtful chat, and I really loved reading through it. Steve just put our donate link in there also. I'm about to put our Under the Lens series link for all of uh, this current series that just wrapped up, and then all our past ones. There's some really exciting ones, and we also have some exciting ones on the way for this year. So stay tuned, and please continue to come chat with us for our next webinars. Continue to read, And feel free to email us if you have any questions. Feel free to send us tips. It's tips@shelterforce.org. Send us submissions. We always welcome input, and we always welcome comments and criticism and ideas for what we can cover. So it's been so lovely to have you all, and I will be sure to end this before we get kicked out. Thank you guys so much, and have a lovely day.